She's not going anywhere. A poor single dad stood alone against 5 powerful lawyers. But when the courtroom gasped at his hidden Supreme Court past, the truth hit harder than anyone could imagine. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today. Daniel wiped the grease from his hands with an old red rag, watching Sophie's animated face as she perched on a wooden stool in their garage. Sunlight filtered through the dusty windows, casting a warm glow on her brown hair as she swung her legs back and forth. And then Jenny said we should definitely join the science fair next month. Sophie bubbled, her eyes bright with excitement. We could do something really cool with renewable energy, Dad. Maybe even win first place. Daniel smiled, adjusting the chain on her blue bicycle. The familiar smell of oil and metal filled the air as he worked. That sounds wonderful, sweetheart. Your mom would have loved to see you getting into science. Sophie's face softened at the mention of her mother. I know. Remember how she used to say I was her little Einstein? Before Daniel could respond, 3 sharp knocks echoed from their front door. The sound was heavy, authoritative, nothing like the friendly taps of their neighbors. I'll get it. Sophie hopped off the stool, but Daniel caught her arm gently. Let me handle it, honey. Something in those knocks made his stomach twist. He set down his wrench and headed for the door, wiping his hands one last time on his worn jeans. Opening the door, Daniel found himself facing 5 people in expensive suits, 3 men and 2 women. Their polished appearance seemed out of place on his modest porch. His heart skipped a beat as he recognized his late wife's brother among them. Daniel Carter, one of the women stated, her voice as crisp as her pressed blazer. We need to discuss an urgent matter concerning Sophie. Daniel's grip tightened on the doorframe. What's this about? May we come in? Another lawyer stepped forward, producing a thick manila envelope. No, Daniel said firmly. Whatever you have to say, you can say it here. The woman's lips thinned. Very well. We're here to inform you that we're filing for custody of Sophie. Your current situation is inadequate for raising a child of her potential. The words hit Daniel like a physical blow. Behind him, he heard a small gasp. Sophie had followed him to the door despite his instructions. Dad? Her voice trembled. Sophie, go to your room, Daniel said quietly, not taking his eyes off the lawyers. But Dad, please, sweetheart, just for a moment. He heard her footsteps retreat, followed by a muffled sob that tore at his heart. You have no right, Daniel said, his voice low but steady. Sophie is my daughter. His late wife's brother stepped forward. Daniel, be reasonable. Living in this place, working as a mechanic, Margaret would have wanted better for her daughter. We can provide Sophie with the best education, opportunities you simply can't afford. Daniel's jaw clenched. Margaret wanted Sophie to be loved and happy. That's exactly what she is. Your financial situation is unstable, another lawyer interjected, flipping through papers. The environment here is unsuitable for a child of Sophie's intelligence and potential. The court will see that. Get off my property, Daniel said, his voice carrying a warning edge that made even the lawyers pause. Any communication goes through proper legal channels. We're done here. He shut the door firmly, his hand shaking slightly as he turned the lock. For a moment, he stood there, forehead pressed against the cool wood, gathering his strength. Sophie's crying drew him to her room. She sat on her bed, hugging her knees to her chest, tears streaming down her face. The sight shattered his heart. They can't take me away, she sobbed as he sat beside her. Please, Dad, don't let them take me away. Daniel pulled her into his arms, holding her close as she cried into his shirt. Listen to me, Sophie Carter, he said, his voice firm but gentle. You're not going anywhere. I promise you that. But they're lawyers, she hiccuped. They have money and fancy clothes and they don't have what matters most, Daniel interrupted, lifting her chin so she met his eyes. They don't have love. They don't have our strength. They don't have our faith. Sophie wiped her eyes with the back of her hand. You promise? Cross my heart, Daniel said, making the gesture that had been their special thing since Sophie was little. It brought a wobbly smile to her tear-stained face. The rest of the day passed in a blur. Daniel made Sophie's favorite mac and cheese for dinner, trying to maintain some normalcy. They watched an old movie together, Sophie curled against his side like she used to do when she was younger. but the shadow of the morning's visit hung over them both. When bedtime came, Daniel tucked Sophie in, just as he had every night since she was a toddler. He smoothed her hair back from her forehead, noting how young and vulnerable she looked. "Dad?" she whispered as he was about to turn off the light. "I'm scared." Daniel sat back down on the edge of her bed. "I know, sweetheart. But remember what we always say? Fear doesn't win." Sophie recited their familiar mantra. "Love does. That's right." He kissed her forehead. "Get some sleep. I love you more than all the stars in the sky. Love you more than all the sand on every beach," she whispered back, their nightly ritual bringing a small measure of comfort to them both. Daniel waited until her breathing evened out before quietly leaving her room. In the kitchen, he stood at the sink, staring out at the darkened backyard where Sophie's swing set stood silhouetted against the night sky. The weight of the day pressed down on his shoulders. Closing his eyes, he whispered into the quiet kitchen, "Lord, give me strength. Help me protect our girl. Help me be enough." His voice caught on the last word, but he straightened his shoulders, drawing deep from the well of determination that had seen him through every challenge since Margaret's death. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, but for tonight, Sophie slept peacefully in her bed, safe under his roof. And Daniel Carter intended to keep it that way, no matter what it took. The old church bells chimed as families filed into First Community Church that Sunday morning. Daniel held the heavy wooden door open for Sophie, his hand resting protectively on her shoulder. The familiar scent of wood polish and aging hymnals filled the air, but something felt different today. The usual warm greeting seemed muted, replaced by darting glances and hushed whispers. "Did you hear about the Carter girl?" a woman whispered behind her bulletin. "Such a shame," another responded. Those relatives could give her so much more. Daniel pretended not to hear, guiding Sophie toward their usual pew near the middle. She pressed closer to his side, her small hand gripping his suit jacket. The worn fabric didn't match the crisp designer clothes around them, but it was his Sunday best. Mrs. Henderson, who usually sat next to them, suddenly found a spot 3 rows ahead. The empty space felt like a wall building around them. Sophie's shoulders slumped as she slid into the pew. Pastor Evelyn stood at the pulpit, her silver hair catching the morning light streaming through the stained glass windows. Her kind eyes found Daniel's, and she gave him a gentle nod. There was strength in that simple gesture. "Today's scripture," Pastor Evelyn began, her steady voice filling the sanctuary, "speaks of standing firm in faith when storms arise." Sophie pulled out her notebook, the same one she'd used to take sermon notes since she was old enough to write. Daniel watched her careful handwriting, his heart aching at how grown-up she seemed. Too grown-up for what she was facing. After the service, while families gathered in the fellowship hall for coffee and cookies, Daniel noticed Sophie's absence. He found her in the Sunday school room, alone in the corner, pretending to arrange books on a shelf. "Sophie," he called softly, "don't you want a cookie?" She shook her head, keeping her back to him. "Tommy said his mom thinks I'd be better off with rich relatives." Her voice cracked. "He said you can't take care of me properly." Before Daniel could respond, Pastor Evelyn appeared in the doorway. "Sophie, dear, would you help Mrs. Watson set up for next week's lesson? She could use your organizational skills." Sophie nodded, wiping her eyes quickly before hurrying out. Pastor Evelyn closed the door and turned to Daniel. "Sit with me a moment," she said, settling into one of the small chairs meant for children. Daniel lowered himself into another, feeling oddly like a student about to receive counsel. "The congregation's talking," he said quietly. "Let them talk." Pastor Evelyn's voice was firm but gentle. "Daniel, do you remember the story of David and Goliath?" "Sophie loves that one," he replied, managing a small smile. "Everyone saw a shepherd boy facing a giant. They whispered that he had no chance. She leaned forward, her eyes intent. But David knew something they didn't. He knew that truth and faith are stronger than any giant. You have both, Daniel." "I'm not David," he whispered. "I'm just me." "And that's exactly who you need to be. God doesn't call us to be anyone else." She reached out, patting his hand. "Your love for Sophie shines through everything you do. That truth will prevail." The fellowship hall was emptying when they returned. Sophie stood by the cookie table, carefully wrapping 2 chocolate chip cookies in a napkin. She brought them to Daniel, pressing them into his hand. "For later," she said. "You didn't get any." The simple gesture nearly broke him. This was his daughter, thoughtful, caring, strong. How could anyone think he was unfit to raise her? That evening, their small kitchen table felt like an island of peace. Daniel had made Sophie's favorite mac and cheese, and she was telling him about the Bible story Mrs. Watson had asked her to help teach next week. It's about Joseph, she explained, pushing her peas around her plate. How his brothers were mean to him, but he still trusted God had a plan. Daniel's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Sometimes his daughter's wisdom struck him speechless. That's right, he managed. And what happened to Joseph in the end? Everything worked out better than before. Sophie looked up at him, her eyes full of trust. Just like it will for us, right, Dad? Right, sweetheart. He reached across the table to squeeze her hand. Just like that. After dinner, Sophie went to finish her homework while Daniel tackled the dishes. The warm water couldn't stop his hands from shaking as he scrubbed each plate. The lawyer's words echoed in his mind. Unstable financial situation. Unsuitable environment. Best interests of the child. He gripped the edge of the sink, trying to steady himself. The dish soap bottle had a small crack, and blue liquid was slowly pooling around its base. Such a simple thing to fix. Just need a new bottle. But what about this? How could he fix this? The water ran over his trembling hands as he stared out the kitchen window into the gathering darkness. Tomorrow, the real battle would begin. He had no idea how to win against such powerful opponents, but he had to try. Sophie's whole world depended on it. Monday morning dawned cold and gray as Daniel steered his weathered pickup truck through downtown. His knuckles were white on the steering wheel, and he kept glancing in the rearview mirror at Sophie, who sat quietly in her best church dress, fidgeting with its hem. The courthouse loomed ahead, an imposing brick building with tall white columns that seemed to pierce the overcast sky. Daniel's heart hammered against his ribs as he parked in the nearly empty lot. It was early, but he couldn't risk being late. "Ready, sweetheart?" he asked, his voice steadier than he felt. Sophie nodded, her face pale, but determined. "Ready, Daddy?" Inside, their footsteps echoed through the marble hallway. The air felt thick, with the musty smell of old papers and furniture polish. They found their way to courtroom C, where a handful of people already waited on the wooden benches, mostly curious townspeople who'd heard about the case. The opposition arrived precisely at 8:55 a.m., 5 lawyers in expensive suits, led by Richard Morton, his late wife's cousin. They barely acknowledged Daniel as they swept past, their leather briefcases gleaming in the fluorescent light. "All rise!" The bailiff's voice boomed across the room as Judge Marion Peterson entered, her black robes rustling as she took her seat. Daniel squeezed Sophie's hand before she went to sit with Mrs. Walker, their church secretary who'd offered to watch her during the proceedings. Morton spoke first, his voice smooth as polished marble. "Your Honor, we're here today because we have serious concerns about Sophie Carter's current living situation." He gestured toward Daniel with manicured fingers. "Mr. Carter works as a mechanic, with irregular hours and unpredictable income. The child lives in a small rental house on the wrong side of town, attending an underfunded public school." Daniel's jaw tightened, but he kept his expression neutral. He could feel the weight of everyone's stares. "Furthermore," Morton continued, "Mr. Carter has shown increasingly erratic behavior since his wife's passing. He abandoned a successful career without explanation, moving Sophie away from her extended family and support system." The judge peered over her reading glasses at Daniel. "Mr. Carter, are you representing yourself today?" "Yes, Your Honor." Daniel's voice came out clear and steady, surprising even himself. Morton's lips curled slightly. "As I was saying, we believe Sophie would benefit enormously from living with her mother's family. We can provide her with private education, cultural opportunities, and the stability she deserves." For the next hour, Morton and his colleagues presented their case. They showed charts of Daniel's income, photos of their sprawling estate compared to his modest home, and testimonies from experts about the importance of affluent environments for child development. The judge's expression grew increasingly concerned, and Daniel could feel hope slipping away like water through his fingers. But when Morton finally sat down, Daniel stood, straightened his tie, and approached the podium. "Mr. Morton," he began, his voice quiet but firm, "you mentioned Sophie's current school is underfunded. Could you please specify your sources for this assessment?" Morton blinked. "Well, it's common knowledge that public schools in this district—" "Common knowledge isn't admissible evidence, Counselor." Daniel's tone shifted subtly, taking on an authority that made several heads turn. In fact, according to the State Education Board's latest report, Sophie's school ranks in the top 15% for academic achievement. Would you like to see those statistics? A murmur rippled through the courtroom. Morton's confident smile faltered slightly. Daniel continued, his questions precise and methodical. You also claimed my income is irregular. Could you please provide the court with documentation showing my payment history for the past year? We have bank statements showing regular weekly deposits from Carter's Auto Service, plus quarterly profit-sharing payments, all reported properly on my tax returns. Daniel produced a neat folder of documents. Your Honor, I'd like to submit these as evidence. The judge accepted the papers, looking increasingly interested. Morton's face had grown slightly pale, and regarding the matter of stability, Daniel's voice took on an edge of steel. Could you explain why you waited until now to file this petition? Sophie has been in my sole custody for 3 years. During that time, how many attempts did you make to contact her, to visit, to contribute to her well-being? The silence in the courtroom was deafening. Morton shuffled his papers, clearly thrown off balance. That's not relevant to— It's entirely relevant, counselor, and you know it. Daniel's calm certainty made the words land like hammer blows. In fact, isn't it true that the only contact you've had with Sophie since her mother's passing was last Christmas, when you sent her a card with a $20 bill? Gasps filled the courtroom. Even the judge raised her eyebrows. Mr. Morton, Daniel continued, would you please explain to the court the specific legal grounds for claiming I'm an unfit parent? Not assumptions, not implications, the actual grounds under state law. Morton's face had turned an interesting shade of red. He glanced at his colleagues, who suddenly seemed very interested in their notepads. I'll wait, Daniel said quietly, and something in his tone made several people in the gallery sit up straighter. This wasn't just a small-town mechanic anymore. This was something else entirely. The morning continued with Daniel systematically dismantling their arguments, citing precedents and statutes with casual precision. By noon, when the judge called for a recess, the atmosphere in the courtroom had shifted dramatically. Outside in the hallway, Sophie rushed to hug him, her eyes wide with amazement. Daddy, how did you know all that? Daniel loosened his tie, suddenly looking tired. Let's get some lunch, sweetheart. I'm thinking maybe those sandwiches from Joe's Diner? Sophie's question hung in the air, unanswered, but her father's eyes held something she'd never quite noticed before, a depth of knowledge that went far beyond fixing carburetors and changing oil. Mrs. Walker touched Daniel's arm as they walked toward the courthouse steps. Daniel, she whispered, I had no idea. But Daniel just smiled, his attention focused on Sophie as they stepped out into the weak autumn sunlight, leaving a wake of buzzing speculation behind them. The evening sun cast long shadows through the kitchen window as Daniel stirred a pot of his famous chicken soup. Sophie sat at their small wooden table, her homework spread out before her, but her pencil hadn't moved in minutes. She kept watching her father with questioning eyes. Daddy, she finally said, pushing aside her math worksheet, how did you know all those fancy legal words today? And what's a precedent? You used that word at least 3 times. Daniel's hand paused mid-stir. He'd known this conversation was coming, but that didn't make it any easier. Just picked it up here and there, sweetie, he said softly, not meeting her eyes. No way. Sophie crossed her arms. You sounded just like those lawyers, except better. Way better. Even Judge Thompson looked surprised. The soup bubbled, and Daniel focused on adjusting the heat. Maybe we should talk about your algebra instead. Dad! Sophie's voice carried that stubborn tone she'd inherited from her mother. Please don't treat me like a little kid. Something's going on, and I want to know what it is. Daniel turned off the burner and gripped the counter's edge. The kitchen clock ticked loudly in the silence. Finally, he pulled out a chair and sat across from his daughter. You're right, he said quietly. There's something I should have told you a long time ago. He ran a hand through his graying hair. Before I was a mechanic, before you were born, I was a different kind of person. I was a lawyer, too. Sophie's eyes widened. Really? Not just any lawyer. Daniel's voice grew softer. I argued cases before the Supreme Court of the United States. Sophie's mouth fell open. The Supreme Court? Like the real one? In Washington? Daniel nodded. I won 5 cases there. Made it into law journals. Had my picture in the Washington Post. He smiled sadly. That's actually how I met your mother. She was a clerk for one of the justices. But Sophie struggled to process this information. Why didn't you tell me? And why are you fixing cars now instead of being a fancy lawyer? Daniel reached across the table and took her hand. Because 8 years ago, when your mother got sick, everything changed. After she died, I had a choice to make. I could keep being that important lawyer, working 80-hour weeks, always traveling, or I could be the father you needed. Tears welled in Sophie's eyes. You gave it all up? For me? It wasn't giving up, sweetheart. It was choosing what mattered most. Daniel squeezed her hand. You needed stability, a real home, not some nanny raising you while I flew around the country. So I moved us here, where your mother grew up, where things were simpler. Sophie pushed back her chair and threw her arms around her father's neck. I love you, Daddy. The next morning, word spread through town like wildfire. Daniel Carter, the quiet mechanic who could fix any engine, had once been a Supreme Court lawyer. Mrs. Peterson at the grocery store insisted on giving him an extra bag of apples for that brilliant legal mind. Mr. Johnson at the hardware store suddenly wanted his opinion on constitutional law while buying spark plugs. At church on Wednesday night, Pastor Evelyn beamed at Daniel. The Lord works in mysterious ways, she said. Perhaps he's been preparing you for this very moment. But not everyone's reaction was positive. Standing in line at the post office, Daniel overheard Mr. Harrison muttering to his wife, Thinks he's better than us, hiding behind that mechanic's uniform, probably looking down on us simple folk this whole time. At the diner, where Daniel and Sophie often had Saturday breakfast, some regulars moved to different tables. Their usual waitress, Betty, seemed nervous serving them, as if she might use the wrong fork in front of such an important person. Sophie noticed it all. After school on Thursday, she burst into the garage where Daniel was working on Mrs. Wilson's minivan. Jeremy's dad told him you're a fraud, she exclaimed, her face red with anger. He said if you were really such a hotshot lawyer, you wouldn't be here fixing cars. Daniel slid out from under the van, wiping his hands on a rag. Some people don't understand that success isn't just about titles or money, Sophie. But you could prove them wrong. You could go back to being important. I am important, Daniel interrupted gently. I'm your father. That's the most important job I'll ever have. That evening, they sat on their small front porch, watching the stars appear one by one in the darkening sky. The air was cool and crisp, carrying the scent of autumn leaves. Sophie leaned her head against her father's shoulder. I looked up your old cases online at the library today, she said quietly. You never lost a single one at the Supreme Court. Daniel chuckled. The librarian helped you with that research, did she? Mrs. Myers was very interested. Sophie sat up straighter. Then you'll win this case too, Daddy, because you never lost with me. Daniel smiled, though his heart felt heavy. He wanted to share her confidence, but he knew the legal world well enough to understand that truth didn't always prevail. The lawyers opposing them had resources, connections, and a determination to win at any cost. But looking at his daughter's trusting face in the starlight, he couldn't bring himself to voice his doubts. Instead, he pulled her closer, and together they watched a shooting star streak across the velvet sky. The morning sun filtered through the autumn leaves as Sophie walked up the concrete steps to Jefferson Middle School. Her backpack felt heavier than usual, weighed down not just by books, but by the whispers that seemed to follow her everywhere now. Something was different today. Sarah Miller, usually the first to wave hello, suddenly became fascinated with her phone screen as Sophie passed by. Near the lockers, Tommy Chen, who'd shared his math notes with her all semester, quickly shut his locker and hurried away. Sophie's stomach tightened as she made her way to first period English. Mrs. Peterson, who always greeted her with a warm smile, barely met her eyes when handing back yesterday's essay. The red A at the top of her paper offered little comfort. During lunch, Sophie found herself sitting alone at the far end of the cafeteria table. The seat next to her, usually occupied by her best friend Lisa, remained empty. She picked at her sandwich, her appetite gone, watching as Lisa sat with a different group, throwing occasional guilty glances in her direction. Did you hear about her dad? Sophie's ears caught the whispered conversation from the table behind her. My mom said he drinks. That's why he quit being a lawyer. I heard he leaves her alone at night to go to bars, another voice added. Sophie's eyes burned with tears. She wanted to turn around and scream that it wasn't true, that her dad was the best father anyone could have. Instead, she gathered her things and fled to the girls' bathroom, where she spent the rest of lunch period trying not to cry. Meanwhile, across town at Carter's Auto Repair, Daniel wiped his greasy hands on a shop rag as his friend Mike Martinez rushed in, looking troubled. "Daniel, you need to hear this," Mike said, lowering his voice despite the noise of the garage. "Those lawyers, they're spreading stories all over town. Bad ones." Daniel's hands stilled on the rag. "What kind of stories?" "They're saying you had drinking problems in Washington, that you lost cases because you showed up drunk. There's even talk about you leaving Sophie alone at night." Mike's face was grim. "It's hitting the school board now. Parents are calling, asking questions." Before Daniel could respond, his phone buzzed. The caller ID showed Child Protective Services. His heart sank as he answered. An hour later, Ms. Harper from Social Services stood in their living room, her notebook open as she surveyed the modest but well-kept house. She was younger than Daniel expected, with kind eyes behind professional glasses, but her presence still felt like an invasion. "Mr. Carter, I want to be clear. These are serious allegations we have to investigate," she said, making notes as she walked through the kitchen. "Multiple reports have been filed expressing concern for Sophie's welfare." Daniel followed her, fighting to keep his voice steady. "Those reports are false. They're coming from my late wife's family. They're trying to take Sophie away." Miss Harper paused at the refrigerator, studying Sophie's artwork and perfect test scores proudly displayed with magnets. "I understand this is difficult," she said, her tone softening slightly. "But we have to follow up on every report. Sophie's safety is our primary concern." She moved through the house methodically, checking Sophie's room with its neatly made bed and well-organized desk, inspecting the fully stocked pantry, noting the family photos lining the hallway walls. Daniel could see her taking in every detail. The worn but clean furniture, the stack of library books on the coffee table, the calendar on the wall marked with Sophie's activities and appointments. "Sophie's grades are excellent," Miss Harper commented, reviewing school records from her file. "And her attendance is perfect. She loves school," Daniel said quietly. "At least, she did until today." Miss Harper looked up sharply. "Has something changed?" Daniel ran a hand through his hair. "The rumors are spreading. Kids can be cruel when they hear things about their classmates' parents." Something flickered in Miss Harper's eyes, a moment of genuine sympathy, quickly replaced by professional detachment. "I'll need to interview Sophie separately," she said. "And we'll be conducting follow-up visits, both announced and unannounced." "I understand," Daniel replied, though each word felt like swallowing glass. After Miss Harper left, Daniel called the school and picked Sophie up early. The drive home was quiet, Sophie staring out the window as houses and trees blurred past. "You want to talk about it, sweetheart?" he asked gently. Sophie shook her head, then whispered, "Why are they lying about you, Dad?" Daniel gripped the steering wheel tighter. "Sometimes people will say anything to get what they want, but the truth is stronger than lies. We just have to hold on to that." That evening, after Sophie had gone to bed, Daniel sat alone at the kitchen table. The custody summons lay before him, the legal language cold and threatening under the yellow light of the overhead lamp. His fingers traced the embossed court seal, remembering how many times he'd been on the other side of such documents, never imagining he'd one day be the defendant. The house was quiet except for the gentle hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of crickets through the slightly open window. Daniel stared at the papers, the weight of what they represented settling heavily on his shoulders. This wasn't just about legal arguments anymore. The lawyers were playing a different game now, trying to destroy his reputation, poisoning the community against him. He glanced at Sophie's latest art project hanging on the fridge, a drawing of the two of them holding hands, the words, "Best Dad Ever," written in careful letters across the top. The sight of it made his throat tight. Everything he'd done, every choice he'd made since Emily's death, had been for Sophie. Now those very choices were being twisted into weapons against them. The summons seemed to mock him from the kitchen table, its legal threats now backed by whispered lies and community suspicion. Daniel knew, with a certainty that chilled him, that this was only the beginning. The real battle wasn't in the courtroom. It was for their very lives in this town they called home. Dawn crept over the small town, painting the sky in gentle strokes of pink and gold. In the Carters' modest garage, The rhythmic sound of metal against metal echoed as Daniel worked beneath the hood of Mrs. Peterson's ancient Chevrolet. His hands moved with practiced precision, finding comfort in the familiar task. Grease smudged his forearms, and sweat dotted his brow despite the morning chill. The garage door creaked, and Sophie's footsteps shuffled across the concrete floor. "Dad?" she called softly, holding 2 steaming mugs of hot cocoa. The sweet aroma filled the space, mixing with the scents of oil and metal. Daniel emerged from under the hood, wiping his hands on a red shop rag. His face softened at the sight of his daughter, still in her pajamas and fuzzy slippers, her hair tied in a messy ponytail. "You're up early, sweetheart." "Couldn't sleep," Sophie admitted, offering him one of the mugs. "Made it just how you like it. Extra chocolate, tiny marshmallows." Daniel's throat tightened. It was their tradition. These quiet, morning moments with hot cocoa, started by his late wife years ago. "Just perfect," he managed, taking a careful sip. The warmth spread through his chest, carrying memories of happier times. Sophie hopped onto the workbench, her legs swinging. "Remember when Mom used to bring us cocoa while you worked on her old Volkswagen?" "Every Saturday morning," Daniel nodded, leaning against the car. "She'd tell me I was making it worse, not better. But you always fixed it," Sophie said proudly. The sound of tires on gravel drew their attention. Pastor Evelyn's weathered station wagon pulled up to the garage, its familiar rattle announcing her arrival. She stepped out, her silver hair neat despite the early hour, a worn Bible tucked under her arm. "I thought I might find you both here," she said warmly, entering the garage. "The Lord put you on my heart this morning." Daniel straightened, suddenly aware of his grease-stained appearance. "Pastor Evelyn, we're not exactly dressed for company." She waved away his concern. "The Lord sees our hearts, Daniel, not our clothes. And speaking of hearts," she paused, her kind eyes taking in their tired faces. "How are you both holding up?" Sophie's legs stopped swinging. "People at school are saying mean things about Dad." Pastor Evelyn moved closer, placing a gentle hand on Sophie's shoulder. "Truth is like pure gold, dear one. No amount of dirt can change what it really is. But it hurts," Sophie whispered. "That's why we pray," Pastor Evelyn said firmly. She opened her Bible, its pages well worn with use. "Shall we?" Daniel set down his mug and moved to stand beside Sophie. Pastor Evelyn's strong, steady voice filled the garage as she prayed, asking for protection, wisdom, and peace. Her words wrapped around them like a warm blanket, and Daniel felt some of his tension ease. As she finished, Daniel's mind cleared. He'd been approaching this all wrong, trying to fight fire with fire. "I need to show them," he said slowly. "Show them what, Dad?" Sophie asked. "Everything." Daniel's voice grew stronger. "Every doctor's appointment I've taken you to, every parent, teacher conference, every homework assignment we've worked on together." He began pacing, energy coursing through him. "The birthday parties, the science fairs, the times I've stayed up all night when you were sick." Pastor Evelyn nodded approvingly. "Let your light shine before others, that they may see your good deeds." "I've got pictures," Sophie said excitedly, jumping down from the workbench. "And my report cards? And the article from when we won the father-daughter science fair." Daniel stopped pacing, drawing Sophie into a hug. "We'll show them that being a good father isn't about money or power. It's about love, dedication, and being there every single day. And faith," Pastor Evelyn added softly. "Don't forget that your strength comes from above, Daniel." They spent the next hour gathering evidence of their life together. Photos, school records, medical documents, and letters from teachers. Sophie brought out her scrapbook, filled with ticket stubs from movies they'd seen together and programs from her school plays. "Look, Dad." She pointed to a photo of them covered in flour, attempting to bake cookies. "Remember when the kitchen looked like a snowstorm hit it?" Daniel laughed, really laughed, for the first time in days. Your mother would have had a fit if she'd seen that mess. As the morning wore on, Pastor Evelyn helped them organize everything into a clear narrative of their life together. Not just the big moments, but the small ones too, the daily acts of love that made up their family. When evening came, Daniel tucked Sophie into bed, as he had every night since she was tiny. Instead of their usual routine, Sophie slid off the bed and onto her knees beside it. "Can we pray together, Dad, like we did with Pastor Evelyn?" Daniel knelt beside her, his heart full. Sophie's small hand found his, squeezing tight. The words came easily now, flowing from a place of hope rather than fear. As they finished, he pulled her close. "We'll face them together," he whispered into her hair. "You and me, kiddo, just like always." The bell above Mac's diner chimed as Daniel and Sophie stepped inside. The familiar scent of coffee and fresh pancakes wrapping around them like a warm blanket. Morning sunlight streamed through the large windows, casting a golden glow across the worn checkerboard tiles. Behind the counter, Mac himself waved a spatula in greeting, his weathered face creasing into a smile. "The usual Carter family?" Mac called out, already reaching for 2 mugs. "Yes, please," Daniel replied, guiding Sophie to their regular booth near the window. The vinyl seats squeaked as they settled in, and Sophie immediately reached for the sugar packets, arranging them in neat rows like she always did. Tom Henderson, the local hardware store owner, looked up from his newspaper at the next table. "Daniel, been meaning to catch up with you." He slid into their booth uninvited, but his presence was welcome. More familiar faces turned toward them. Mary from the flower shop, Coach Wilson from Sophie's school, and elderly Mrs. Peterson, who'd lived on their street forever. Daniel's hands wrapped around the warm coffee mug Mac brought over. "I suppose you've all heard about what's happening. Those fancy lawyers giving you trouble?" Mary asked, pulling up a chair. Her kind eyes filled with concern. "My sister works at the courthouse. Said you gave quite the performance the other day." Sophie beamed with pride. "Dad was amazing. You should have seen him." "Look, Daniel," Tom leaned forward, his voice low and steady. "I've known you since you fixed my truck that first week you came to town. Never met a more honest man. I'll testify to that in court if you need me to." Mrs. Peterson nodded vigorously. "Me too. I remember how you helped clear my walkway every snowfall last winter. Wouldn't take a penny for it. And Sophie here," she patted the girl's hand. "Such a well-raised young lady." Coach Wilson joined their growing circle, pulling over another chair. "Those Prescotts think money talks, but they don't know this town. Sophie's one of my best students, always helping the younger kids during PE. Never a complaint. That comes from good parenting." Daniel felt a lump forming in his throat. "I appreciate that, all of you. But the Prescotts, they're powerful people." "Let me make some calls," Mary offered, her expression determined. "My brother-in-law's a private investigator in the city. Bet he could dig up some interesting information about these lawyers." Mac appeared with plates of steaming pancakes, setting them down with authority. "On the house today," he declared, ignoring Daniel's protests. "And Daniel? My security cameras caught one of those suits taking pictures of your car yesterday. Got it all on tape if you need evidence of harassment." Sophie's fork paused halfway to her mouth. "They're watching us?" Daniel reached across the table, squeezing her hand. "Don't worry about that, sweetheart. Focus on your breakfast." But Sophie straightened in her seat, a familiar determination crossing her face. "No, Dad. I'm not going to pretend everything's okay. Yesterday at school, I told Jennifer and Mike the truth when they asked about the rumors. About how you gave up being a famous lawyer to take care of me. About how you never miss my soccer games even when you're tired from work. Sophie." Daniel started, but she wasn't finished. "And today I'm going to tell more people. They need to know what kind of father you are. The Prescotts can't just make up lies about us." The adults exchanged impressed glances. Mrs. Peterson dabbed at her eyes with a napkin. "You've got spirit, girl," Coach Wilson said approvingly. "Standing up for what's right, that's another thing you learned from your dad." More townspeople drifted over to their booth, each offering support in their own way. Bill from the auto parts store promised to spread the word among his customers. Sarah, whose daughter was in Sophie's class, volunteered to organize other parents for a show of support at the next court date. Daniel felt overwhelmed by their kindness, remembering how lonely those first months in town had been after Clara's death. Now, looking at these faces, some he saw daily, others just in passing, he realized they'd become more than neighbors. They were family. "We take care of our own," Mac declared, refilling coffee cups. "Those city lawyers might have fancy degrees, but they don't understand what community means." Sophie finished her pancakes, looking more relaxed than she had in days. The diner had become a war room of sorts, with people sharing information and making plans. Tom was already on his phone, calling his cousin who worked at the county records office. Mary was writing down her brother-in-law's contact information. "Dad," Sophie whispered, tugging at his sleeve, "I think we're going to be okay." Daniel smiled. though his heart ached with love for his daughter's unwavering faith. "I think so too, sweetheart." As they prepared to leave, the diner had grown louder with conversation and purpose. People were standing up to fear, choosing sides, deciding that sometimes doing what was right meant taking risks. Daniel felt both humbled and strengthened by their support. He helped Sophie into her jacket, thanking Mac one more time for breakfast. The bell chimed again as they stepped out into the morning sunshine, their spirits lifted by the impromptu gathering of allies. But across the street, partially hidden behind a newspaper stand, stood Richard Prescott, the youngest of the lawyer's siblings. His expensive suit looked out of place among the modest storefronts. As Daniel and Sophie walked to their car, he pulled out his phone, punched in a number, and lifted it to his ear, his cold gaze never leaving the father and daughter. The morning sun cast long shadows across Daniel's modest living room as he straightened the last family photo on the wall. His hands trembled slightly, betraying the anxiety he tried so hard to hide. Sophie darted from room to room, checking everything one last time. "Dad, do you think Miss Harper will like my science project?" Sophie called from her bedroom, where she'd carefully arranged her latest school achievement on her desk. "Of course she will, sweetheart," Daniel replied, his voice steady despite his nerves. He glanced at his watch. 9:58 a.m. Miss Harper would arrive any minute for the home study. The doorbell rang precisely at 10 a.m. Sophie froze in the hallway, clutching her worn stuffed rabbit to her chest. Daniel took a deep breath, squeezed her shoulder reassuringly, and opened the door. Miss Harper stood on the porch, her gray blazer crisp and professional, a leather portfolio tucked under her arm. Her expression was neutral, but her eyes were kind. "Good morning, Mr. Carter, Sophie. Please come in," Daniel gestured welcomingly. "We've been looking forward to your visit." Miss Harper stepped inside, her trained eye taking in every detail of their home. The furniture was old but well-maintained, the floors spotless, and family photos adorned every wall. She noticed Sophie's art projects proudly displayed on the refrigerator, held by mismatched magnets. "Would you like some coffee?" Daniel offered. "Sophie just helped me bake some banana bread, too." "That would be lovely, thank you." Miss Harper smiled, noting how naturally father and daughter moved together in the kitchen. Sophie knew exactly where the good mugs were kept, while Daniel sliced the still warm bread. "Sophie, would you like to show me your room while your father prepares the coffee?" Miss Harper suggested gently. Sophie's face lit up. "Yes, ma'am. I cleaned it extra special." She led the way down the hallway, her previous nervousness forgotten in her excitement to share her personal space. Sophie's room was a testament to a childhood well-loved. The walls were painted a soft yellow, decorated with her own artwork and photographs. A bookshelf overflowed with well-read novels and school books. On her desk sat the science project she'd been worried about, a carefully constructed model of the solar system. "I made this all by myself," Sophie explained proudly. "Well, Dad helped a little with the hot glue gun. He says safety first." Miss Harper noticed a framed photograph on Sophie's nightstand, a beautiful woman with Sophie's same warm brown eyes, holding a much younger Sophie. "Is this your mother?" Sophie's voice softened. "Yes. Dad makes sure I have lots of pictures of her. He tells me stories about her every night before bed." Miss Harper's gaze fell on a wall calendar filled with notes. Dad-daughter movie night, library day, science club. Every square seemed to hold some special moment shared between father and daughter. Daniel appeared in the doorway with coffee and banana bread. "I hope Sophie isn't talking your ear off about her solar system project," he said with a gentle smile. "Actually, I was just admiring how organized everything is," Miss Harper replied, accepting the coffee. "Sophie, would you mind if I spoke with your father alone for a few minutes?" Sophie nodded, understanding the gravity of the moment. "I'll go practice my piano," she said, squeezing her father's hand as she passed. In the living room, Miss Harper sat across from Daniel, her portfolio open on her lap. The sound of Sophie's careful piano practice drifted through the house. For Elise, played with determination, if not perfect accuracy. "Mr. Carter," Miss Harper began, her tone professional but gentle, "I want to be straightforward with you. Your home is loving and clean, and your dedication to Sophie is evident in every corner. However," she paused, choosing her words carefully, "the courts place significant weight on financial stability. Your income as a mechanic, while steady, might be considered limited compared to what Sophie's relatives could provide. Daniel's hands tightened around his coffee mug. I understand that I can't give Sophie everything money can buy, but I can give her what matters most: love, stability, a sense of belonging. The house needs repairs, Miss Harper noted, glancing at a water stain on the ceiling. And I notice Sophie's winter coat is quite worn. I'm saving for a new roof, Daniel admitted quietly. And Sophie's growing so fast. We were waiting for the end of season sale for a new coat. But she never goes without what she needs. Never. Miss Harper watched as Daniel's eyes drifted to the piano where Sophie played, his face filled with such pure love it made her throat tight. You know, Mr. Carter, in my years as a social worker, I've seen many wealthy homes that were emotionally bankrupt. And I've seen modest homes rich with love. She closed her portfolio and leaned forward. The law requires me to consider all factors, but I want you to know something. Her voice dropped to nearly a whisper. Mr. Carter, don't give up. I believe Sophie belongs with you. Daniel's eyes glistened as he met her gaze, hope flickering in his expression. The piano music stopped, and Sophie's footsteps approached the living room, hesitant and questioning. Ms. Harper stood, gathering her things. Thank you for the coffee and banana bread. It was delicious. She paused at the door, watching as Sophie immediately moved to her father's side, their automatic closeness speaking volumes about their bond. The morning sun cast long shadows across the courthouse steps as Daniel and Sophie climbed them together. Daniel's worn work boots made a steady rhythm against the stone, while Sophie's sneakers skipped nervously beside him. Inside, the polished wooden benches of Courtroom 3 were already filling with familiar faces from town. Mrs. Peterson from the diner sat in the front row, her gray hair neatly pinned back, hands folded over her floral apron. Behind her, Mike from the auto parts store kept checking his watch, probably worried about leaving his teenage son to mind the shop. Even old Mr. Thompson, who'd been coming to Daniel's garage for oil changes for the past 5 years, had traded his usual overalls for a pressed shirt and tie. All rise, called the bailiff, and Judge Martinez entered, her black robe swishing as she took her seat. Daniel squeezed Sophie's hand before she went to sit with Pastor Evelyn in the gallery. The morning proceeded like a slow-motion chess match. One by one, Daniel's friends approached the witness stand. Mrs. Peterson spoke first, her voice wavering with emotion. I see them every Sunday morning after church, she testified, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Daniel always lets Sophie order whatever she wants for breakfast, but makes sure she finishes her milk. They sit there doing crossword puzzles together, laughing like best friends. Mike from the auto parts store cleared his throat roughly when he took the stand. Look, I've known Daniel Carter for years now. Man's got more integrity in his little finger than most folks have in their whole body. Last winter, when my truck broke down during that big storm, Daniel came out at midnight to fix it, wouldn't take a dime. Said he knew I needed it to deliver medicine to my mother in the nursing home. Daniel's throat tightened as he watched his community stand up for him, one after another. Mr. Thompson described how Daniel had taught Sophie basic car maintenance, making sure she'd always be safe on the road. Sophie's math teacher praised her excellent grades and Daniel's involvement in her education. But when the opposing lawyers rose for cross-examination, their expensive suits seemed to gleam like armor. They wielded questions like weapons, precise and cutting. Mrs. Peterson, the lead lawyer said smoothly, are you aware that Mr. Carter's income last year was less than half of what our clients could provide for Sophie? Money ain't everything. Mrs. Peterson shot back, but the lawyer was already moving on. And Mr. Thompson, isn't it true that Mr. Carter often brings Sophie to his garage after school? Hardly an appropriate environment for a young lady's development, wouldn't you agree? Daniel watched his neighbor struggle with the question. Well, she does her homework in his office. It's plenty safe. Yes or no, Mr. Thompson? Is an auto repair shop an ideal after-school environment? No, but thank you. No further questions. The morning wore on. The opposition produced thick folders of financial statements, projecting them onto a screen for the court to see. Daniel's modest income was displayed in stark black and white, alongside glossy photos of his in-laws' sprawling estate. As you can see, Your Honor, the lawyer declared, the contrast in quality of life we could provide is stark. Private schools, summer programs, cultural opportunities. Daniel's hands clenched under the table. They made his life with Sophie sound so small, so inadequate. They couldn't see the wealth of love in their simple morning routines, the richness of their evening talks, the treasure of their shared laughter. Pastor Evelyn was the last to testify. She spoke of Daniel's dedication to Sophie's spiritual growth, their regular attendance at church, their involvement in community service projects. But even her steady voice seemed to waver under the opposition's relentless questioning about Daniel's financial stability. When court adjourned for the day, Daniel felt drained. The sunlight outside seemed harsh after hours under fluorescent lights. Sophie bounced down the courthouse steps beside him, her brown ponytail swinging with determination. She grabbed his hand, her grip fierce and loving.
"We'll win, Daddy,"
she whispered, her faith unshaken.
"You'll see."
Daniel looked down at his daughter, seeing the same quiet strength that had drawn him to her mother all those years ago. His friends were gathering at the bottom of the steps. Mrs. Peterson, Mike, Mr. Thompson, Pastor Evelyn, all of them offering encouraging smiles despite the grueling day. Sophie's hand tightened in his, warm and sure, a reminder of everything worth fighting for. The morning light filtered through the tall courthouse windows, casting warm patches on the worn wooden benches where Daniel and Sophie Saturday. Sophie's hands fidgeted with the hem of her blue Sunday dress, the one her father had carefully ironed the night before. "Dad," Sophie whispered, her voice trembling but determined. "I need to tell them. I need to speak." Daniel's heart clenched. He turned to face his daughter, noting how much she looked like her mother in that moment, the same quiet strength in her eyes. "Sophie, honey, you don't have to do this. The lawyers might ask difficult questions." "But I want to," she insisted, straightening her shoulders. "They need to hear the truth from me." Their lawyer, Mr. Thompson, leaned over from the next bench. "Your Honor," he addressed Judge Martinez, "we'd like to call Sophie Carter to the stand." The opposing lawyers exchanged glances, their expensive suits rustling as they shifted in their seats. One of them, Sophie's Uncle Richard, smirked slightly, as if expecting this would work in their favor. Daniel watched, his throat tight, as Sophie walked to the witness stand. She seemed so small up there, but her chin was lifted high. The bailiff administered the oath, and Sophie's clear voice rang out. "I do." Mr. Thompson approached gently. "Sophie, could you tell us about your life with your father?" Sophie took a deep breath, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. "Every morning Dad makes me breakfast before school. Even when he's really tired from working late at the garage, he never forgets. He makes funny shapes with the pancakes. Sometimes they look more like blobs," she said, earning soft chuckles from the gallery. "But that's okay, because they're made with love." "And what else does your father do for you?" Mr. Thompson prompted. "He helps me with my homework, especially math. He's really patient, even when I get frustrated." Sophie's voice grew stronger. "Every night, we eat dinner together at the table. No phones allowed. That's our rule. We talk about our day, and he always listens, really listens." In the gallery, Miss Harper, the social worker, was taking notes, her expression thoughtful. "When I'm sick," Sophie continued, "he stays up all night with me. Last winter, when I had that really bad flu, he slept in the chair next to my bed for 3 nights straight. He still had to work, but he wouldn't leave me." Daniel remembered those nights, the worry that had gnawed at him as he watched Sophie's fever spike. The memory of her small hand reaching for his in the darkness made his eyes burn. "Could you tell us about special occasions?" Mr. Thompson asked. Sophie's face lit up. "For my birthday last month, Dad couldn't afford the fancy party some of my friends have, but he decorated our whole house with handmade streamers, and he baked my cake himself. It was a little lopsided," she giggled, "but it was the best cake ever because he made it." In the gallery, several people dabbed at their eyes. Even one of the court clerks was trying to discreetly wipe away tears. "And what about your mother?" Mr. Thompson asked gently. Sophie's voice softened. "Dad keeps her memory alive. He tells me stories about her every night. We have her pictures everywhere in our house. Sometimes, when I'm sad about missing her, we sit on the porch swing and look at the stars. Dad says that's where she is now, watching over us." The opposing lawyers stood for cross-examination. "Miss Carter, isn't it true that your father's income is unstable? That sometimes you have to wear second-hand clothes?" Sophie lifted her chin higher. "My dad works really hard. Sometimes he takes extra shifts at the garage so I can have new school supplies or join the soccer team. And you know what? I love my clothes. Dad and I go to thrift stores together and make it fun like a treasure hunt. But surely you'd prefer a more comfortable life, the lawyer pressed. Your aunt and uncle could provide you with everything you need. Everything I need? Sophie's voice cracked with emotion. I need my dad. I need our morning hugs and evening prayers. I need him checking under my bed for monsters, even though I'm too old for that now. I need his voice singing off-key while he makes dinner. She paused, tears rolling down her cheeks. Money can't buy any of that. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Daniel could barely breathe. His own vision blurred with tears. My dad gave up being a fancy lawyer to raise me, Sophie said, her voice growing stronger again. He could have had a big house and expensive cars, but he chose me instead. He chose to be there for every scraped knee, every school play, every nightmare. That's worth more than all the money in the world. When Sophie finally stepped down from the witness stand, her legs were shaking. Daniel met her halfway down the aisle, wrapping her in a tight hug. He could feel her trembling against him, but her arms were strong around his neck. I'm so proud of you, sweetheart, he whispered into her hair, his voice rough with emotion. So incredibly proud. Sophie pulled back just enough to look up at him, her eyes shining. I just told them the truth, Daddy. That's all. Daniel hugged her close again, aware of the tears on his own cheeks but not caring who saw them. In that moment, holding his brave, beautiful daughter, he felt something he hadn't dared to feel in weeks. Hope. Real, tangible hope that glowed as bright as Sophie's smile. The judge called for a brief recess, but Daniel barely heard her. He was too busy thanking God for the miracle that was his daughter, who had just shown everyone in that courtroom what he'd known all along, that love was worth more than gold, and that their little family, though humble, was rich beyond measure. The evening shadows stretched long across Daniel's driveway as he pulled up to his modest home. His chest still swelled with pride from Sophie's brave testimony that morning. Her words in court had touched everyone's hearts. Even the stern-faced bailiff had dabbed at his eyes. Now, the familiar sight of their little house, with its creaky porch swing and Sophie's bicycle leaning against the garage, brought a tired smile to his face. Home sweet home, Sophie said, climbing out of the truck. Her voice still carried the confidence from her courthouse appearance. Daniel followed her up the walkway, his work boots scuffing against the concrete. The motion sensor porch light flickered on, revealing something white on the welcome mat. His heart skipped a beat. What's that? Sophie asked, bending to pick it up. Wait, Daniel said sharply, stopping her. Something about the unmarked envelope made his skin crawl. Let me get it. He picked up the envelope. Expensive paper, no markings, sealed with precision. Inside the house, Sophie went to heat up leftover casserole, while Daniel stood in the hallway, staring at the envelope. His hands trembled slightly as he broke the seal. The documents inside were like a punch to the gut. Photocopies of old legal papers, newspaper clippings, and a formal complaint filed with the Supreme Court Ethics Committee. His eyes scanned the highlighted sections, and his blood ran cold. No, he whispered, this isn't possible. The accusation was there in black and white. Daniel Carter, accused of concealing evidence in the Martinez case, one of his last major cases before leaving his prestigious career. The complaint alleged he had hidden crucial documents that could have changed the outcome. Daddy? Sophie called from the kitchen. Food's ready. Coming, sweetheart, he managed to reply, quickly tucking the papers into his jacket pocket. But sleep eluded him that night as he lay in bed, the accusations burning in his mind like hot coals. The next morning dawned gray and cold. Daniel's stomach churned as they walked up the courthouse steps. Sophie chatted about her upcoming science project, but he could barely focus on her words. He knew what was coming. The courtroom was packed tighter than usual. Daniel recognized familiar faces from town, Pastor Evelyn, Miss Harper the social worker, neighbors who had testified on his behalf. The lawyers for Sophie's relatives sat at their table, looking particularly smug. Judge Harrison entered, and everyone rose. Daniel's heart pounded so hard he could barely hear the initial proceedings. Then the lead lawyer, Richard Whitman, stood up with theatrical flourish. Your Honor, new evidence has come to light that bears directly on Mr. Carter's fitness as a parent. Whitman's voice dripped with false concern. Evidence that reveals a troubling pattern of dishonesty and corruption. Daniel felt Sophie stiffen beside him as Whitman produced copies of the documents from the envelope. The lawyer began reading the accusations aloud, his voice echoing through the suddenly silent courtroom. During his time arguing before the Supreme Court, Mr. Carter deliberately concealed crucial evidence in the Martinez case, evidence that could have changed the outcome for an innocent man. Whitman paused for effect. This formal complaint details how Mr. W.W. Carter abused his position of trust, hiding documents that would have exonerated his opponent's client. Gasps rippled through the courtroom. Daniel saw Pastor Evelyn's hand fly to her mouth, saw Miss Harper's eyes widen in shock. But worst of all was Sophie's small voice beside him. "Daddy, these are lies," Daniel said, standing up. His voice was steady despite the hurricane in his chest. "Your Honor, these accusations were investigated and dismissed 15 years ago. I can explain." "Mr. Carter," Judge Harrison interrupted, her face grave. "These are extremely serious allegations. Why wasn't this disclosed earlier in these proceedings?" "Because it was resolved, Your Honor. It was a false claim made by—" "Do you have documentation proving these charges were dismissed?" the judge asked. Daniel's throat went dry. "The paperwork. It's in storage. In Washington. I would need time to—" "Your Honor," Whitman cut in smoothly. "Given the severity of these allegations and Mr. Carter's inability to disprove them immediately, we move for emergency temporary custody of Sophie Carter, pending a full investigation." "No!" Sophie cried out, grabbing Daniel's arm. "He's lying! My dad would never do that!" Judge Harrison's gavel cracked like thunder. Order in the court. She studied the documents for several long moments, then looked up with sadness in her eyes. "Given the serious nature of these allegations and Mr. Carter's previous position of authority, I have no choice but to err on the side of caution. I hereby grant temporary custody to the maternal relatives, pending full investigation of these claims." The world seemed to tilt sideways. Daniel felt Sophie's fingers digging into his arm as two court officers approached. "You can't!" Sophie screamed, tears streaming down her face. "Please, Judge Harrison! He's my daddy! He's all I have!" Miss Harper stood up from her seat. "Your Honor, please reconsider. I've seen their home, their relationship. My ruling stands," Judge Harrison said firmly, though her voice wavered slightly. "Officers, please escort Miss Carter to her relatives." The officers gently but firmly began separating Sophie from Daniel. She fought like a wild thing, her voice rising to a desperate shriek that shattered Daniel's heart. Daddy, I don't want to go. Please don't let them take me." Daniel reached for her, his own tears falling now. "Sophie, baby, listen to me. I'll fix this. I promise I'll fix this. I love you so much. Daddy!" Sophie's cry echoed through the courtroom as the officers led her away. Her relatives followed, their faces masks of false concern. Daniel stood rooted to the spot, watching helplessly as his daughter disappeared through the heavy wooden doors. The courtroom slowly emptied, people averting their eyes as they passed him. Only Pastor Evelyn remained, placing a gentle hand on his shoulder. But Daniel barely felt it. He could still hear Sophie's screams echoing in his ears, could still feel the ghost of her fingers clutching his arm. His little girl was gone. And for the first time in years, Daniel Carter, former Supreme Court lawyer, devoted father, man of unshakable faith, felt truly lost. The empty house creaked and groaned in the darkness, each sound a haunting reminder of Sophie's absence. Daniel sat on the edge of her bed, his large mechanic's hands gently holding her worn teddy bear. Mr. Hugs, she'd named it when she was 4. The stuffed animal's fuzzy brown fur was matted from years of love and countless washings, one eye slightly loose from too many adventures. "She needs you more than I do right now, old friend," Daniel whispered to the bear, his voice cracking. His fingers traced over the small cross Sophie had stitched onto Mr. Hugs' chest during her crafting phase last summer. The sight of it made his heart ache even more. Moonlight filtered through her bedroom window, casting silver light across the wall of photographs Sophie had carefully arranged. There she was at the park, at church events, working on bikes with him in the garage. Dozens of moments frozen in time. Her bright smile shone in every picture, a testament to the joy they'd shared in their simple life together. Daniel's shoulders began to shake. "Why, God?" he whispered into the darkness. "I gave up everything to give her a good life. I walked away from power and prestige to be the father she needed. His words caught in his throat. Was I wrong? Should I have stayed in Washington, had money and influence instead of Dot, instead of this? The silence that answered felt crushing. He looked around Sophie's room, at her school books neatly stacked on the desk, at the half-finished drawing of their house still taped to the wall, at the small cross above her bed that matched the one she'd sewn onto Mr. Huggs. I can't lose her, he breathed, clutching the teddy bear tighter. She's all I have left. The tears he'd been holding back all day finally broke free, running down his face and falling onto Mr. Huggs's worn fur. A gentle knock at the front door startled him. For a wild moment his heart leaped, but no, it couldn't be Sophie. When he opened the door, Pastor Evelyn stood there, her kind face etched with concern. I thought you might need a friend tonight, she said softly. Daniel stepped back to let her in, quickly wiping his eyes with his sleeve. I don't know what to do anymore, Pastor, he admitted as they sat at the kitchen table. Those lawyers, they took my past and twisted it into something ugly, made me look corrupt. His fist clenched. And now Sophie's gone. Pastor Evelyn reached across the table and placed her weathered hand over his. Daniel, do you remember the story of Joseph? Sold into slavery by his own brothers, imprisoned for crimes he didn't commit. It's hard to think about Bible stories right now, Daniel said, his voice hollow. But Joseph never lost his faith, she continued firmly. Even in his darkest moments, he trusted God's plan. And in the end, what his brothers meant for evil, God used for good. Daniel stared at Mr. Huggs, still clutched in his other hand. I don't understand God's plan in this. Sophie is suffering. She's scared and alone tonight. Faith shines brightest in darkness, Daniel, Pastor Evelyn said gently. Like stars. We can't see them in the daylight, but they're always there waiting to guide us home. She squeezed his hand. Your love for Sophie, your dedication to truth and justice, these are your stars. Don't lose sight of them now. Something stirred in Daniel's chest, a familiar warmth he recognized from countless prayers and quiet moments of grace. I gave up my old life because I believed it was right, he said slowly, because Sophie needed a father more than she needed wealth or status. And you were right, Pastor Evelyn assured him. I've watched Sophie grow into a remarkable young woman under your care. That's not by accident. It's because you chose love over ambition, faith over power. Daniel stood up and walked to the kitchen window, looking out at the night sky. The stars were indeed bright tonight, scattered like diamonds across the darkness. They think they've won because they have money and influence, he said, his voice growing stronger. But they don't have the truth, and truth, like light, has a way of breaking through even the darkest clouds, Pastor Evelyn added, coming to stand beside him. Daniel thought of Sophie's testimony that morning, her pure, honest words about their life together. He thought of Miss Harper, the social worker who had seen the love in their home. He thought of his friends in town, rallying around them despite the risks. I need to pray, he said suddenly, feeling the weight of his earlier doubts lifting. Pastor Evelyn nodded, and together they bowed their heads. Lord, Daniel began, his voice trembling but clear, I'm sorry for doubting. Help me be strong for Sophie. Help me fight for her with truth and love, not bitterness and fear. Guide me through this darkness. Amen. Amen, Pastor Evelyn echoed softly. After she left, Daniel walked to the bathroom and stood before the mirror. His eyes were still red from crying, but there was something else there now. A fire, a determination that reminded him of his courtroom days. But this wasn't about winning cases anymore. This was about something far more precious. Looking at his reflection, he spoke words that felt like a sacred vow. I'll bring her home. He glanced down at Mr. Huggs, still in his hands, and tucked the bear safely in Sophie's bed. Tomorrow, he would start fighting back. Tomorrow, he would show those lawyers what a father's love could do. But tonight, he would let his faith be his strength, knowing that even in this darkness, God's light was still shining. The morning sun filtered through the dusty windows of Daniel's kitchen, where papers and files covered every inch of the table. His coffee had gone cold hours ago, forgotten in the intensity of their search. Frank Wallace sat across from him, his weathered face creased with concentration as he studied another document through his reading glasses. Something's not right here, Daniel, Frank muttered, tapping a yellowed page with his index finger. The dates don't match up. Daniel rubbed his tired eyes. He hadn't slept more than a few hours since Sophie was taken away. The pain of her absence felt like a physical wound in his chest. "What do you mean?" "Look at this." Frank slid the document across the table. "The accusation claims you hid evidence during the Mason case in 2015, but according to these court records, you weren't even assigned to that case until 3 months after the alleged incident." Daniel's hands trembled as he picked up the paper. "I remember that case. I joined halfway through when the original counsel got sick." A knock at the door made them both jump. Miss Harper stood on the porch, holding a thick manila envelope. Her professional demeanor seemed softer today, touched with concern. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said, stepping inside. "I've been doing some digging of my own." Frank cleared space at the table, while Daniel poured fresh coffee. The social worker's presence gave him hope. She'd seen firsthand the love between him and Sophie. "These lawyers," Miss Harper began, spreading out more documents. "They've done this before. I found 3 other cases where they used similar tactics to gain custody of children from single parents, always targeting those who couldn't afford expensive legal battles." Daniel's heart raced. "But why, Sophie? Why us?" Frank's eyes narrowed as he cross-referenced dates and names. "It's about money, isn't it?" "Sophie's trust fund from her mother." Miss Harper nodded grimly. "If they gain custody, they become trustees until she turns 21. That's millions in management fees alone." The morning wore on as they dug deeper. Frank's investigative experience proved invaluable as he connected seemingly unrelated details. By noon, they had filled a whiteboard with names, dates, and connections. "Look at this signature," Frank said suddenly, holding 2 documents side by side. "The one on your supposed misconduct report. It's forged. I've seen enough falsified documents in my career to spot it." Daniel leaned in closer, his legal training kicking in. The strokes were similar but not identical. Someone had tried to copy his signature, but the pressure points were wrong. "And here," Miss Harper added, pointing to another file. "The metadata on these digital records shows they were created just last month, not in 2015. They fabricated the entire accusation." Daniel's hands clenched into fists. All this time, he'd been questioning himself, his choices, even his faith. But the truth was emerging. He'd been set up by people willing to destroy his reputation to get their hands on Sophie's inheritance. Frank pulled out his phone and made a call to an old contact in the forensics lab. "We'll need official verification of the forgery," he explained. "Make it bulletproof for court." Miss Harper straightened her papers with determination. "I'll testify about what I've found. The pattern of behavior, the other cases, it shows clear, malicious intent." Daniel stood at the window, looking out at Sophie's empty swing in the backyard. The morning breeze pushed it gently, a painful reminder of her absence. But now, for the first time since she'd been taken, he felt real hope rising in his chest. "We need to move fast," Frank said, gathering the most damning evidence into a folder. "Before they realize we're on to them." Miss Harper touched Daniel's arm gently. "This changes everything, Mr. Carter. The judge needs to see this immediately." Daniel picked up the evidence folder, holding it like a lifeline. The weight of it felt sacred in his hands, the key to bringing Sophie home. "This changes everything," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. The morning sun had climbed higher, casting long shadows across the kitchen floor. In those shadows, Daniel saw the shape of justice finally taking form. The truth, hidden for so long, was about to come to light. "Let's go," Frank said, gathering his coat. "Time to show these lawyers what real justice looks like." Miss Harper followed them to the door, her professional mask softened by determination. "I'll meet you at the courthouse. This ends today." Daniel gripped the evidence folder tighter, feeling the weight of Sophie's future in his hands. The papers inside held more than just proof of corruption. They held the power to reunite a father and daughter, to restore truth where lies had taken root. The evidence was clear. The truth was undeniable. And in his heart, Daniel knew that Sophie would soon be home where she belonged. The sunlight streamed through the stained glass windows of First Community Church, casting rainbow patterns across the worn wooden pews. Daniel Carter sat in his usual spot, but this Sunday felt different. The whispers that had once been filled with doubt and judgment now carried notes of sympathy and support. Pastor Evelyn's sermon about standing firm in faith echoed through the sanctuary. Daniel noticed several of Sophie's teenage friends from youth groups sitting together, their faces drawn with concern for their missing friend. During the final hymn, he could barely sing past the lump in his throat. After the service, while others filed out, Daniel approached the group of teenagers. They gathered around him, including Jenny Mitchell, Sophie's best friend since 3rd grade, who had tears in her eyes. "How is she?" Jenny asked, twisting the silver friendship bracelet on her wrist, the match to one Sophie always wore. Daniel took a deep breath. "She's staying strong," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "And I want you all to know that I'm not giving up, not for a single minute." "We miss her at youth group," said Tommy, a lanky boy who usually sat next to Sophie during Bible study. "It's not the same without her making those funny comments during discussion time." Mrs. Mitchell, Jenny's mother, approached the group. She had always been kind to Sophie, often having her over for sleepovers. "Daniel," she said, placing a hand on his arm, "we've been praying every day. The whole women's ministry group has." More church members gathered around, forming a circle of support. Mr. Peterson, who had once questioned Daniel's ability to raise Sophie alone, stepped forward. "I was wrong about you, Daniel," he admitted, his weathered face etched with regret. "We've all seen how much you love that girl. What can we do to help?" The question opened a floodgate of ideas. Mrs. Anderson, the retired English teacher, suggested writing letters to the judge about Sophie's character and her life in the community. Mr. Jenkins, who worked at the local newspaper, offered to write an article about the community's support for the Carters. "We could start a petition," Jenny exclaimed, her eyes brightening.
Show everyone how many people want Sophie to come home.
Daniel watched in amazement as the congregation transformed into an army of supporters. People who had barely spoken to him before were now offering help, sharing phone numbers, and organizing committees. Pastor Evelyn joined the group, her presence bringing a sense of purpose to the impromptu gathering. "The church council met yesterday," she announced. "We've decided to make Daniel and Sophie's situation our special prayer focus. We're also opening the fellowship hall every evening this week for anyone who wants to help with the letter-writing campaign." The energy in the sanctuary was electric. Someone brought out paper and pens, and people began drafting letters right there in the pews. Others huddled in small groups, planning ways to show their support. Through his friend Frank, who had visited Sophie in her temporary foster home, Daniel learned that word of the community's efforts had reached her. She had smiled for the first time in days when she heard about Jenny organizing her classmates to wear blue ribbons, Sophie's favorite color, in solidarity. "Tell Daddy I'm being brave," she had told Frank. "Tell him I pray every night just like we used to do together." The message had nearly broken Daniel's heart, but it also strengthened his resolve. Now, watching his neighbors and fellow church members rally around his cause, he felt a surge of hope he hadn't experienced since Sophie was taken away. Mrs. Mitchell organized a phone tree to spread information about court dates and prayer meetings. Mr. Peterson, who owned the local hardware store, put up a large "Bring Sophie Home" sign in his window. Other businesses along Main Street followed suit. Even Mrs. Grayson, the town's most notorious skeptic, who had initially sided with the lawyers, approached Daniel with tears in her eyes. "I saw Sophie grow up in this church," she said, her voice trembling. "I was wrong to doubt you, Daniel. That girl belongs here with her father and her church family." The morning stretched on as more people arrived, having heard through the grapevine about the gathering. The fellowship hall buzzed with activity as people wrote letters, made phone calls, and shared stories about Sophie's impact on their lives. Jenny and her friends sat at a table, creating a scrapbook filled with photos and messages for Sophie. "Remember when she organized that bake sale for the animal shelter?" one girl recalled, carefully pasting a picture into the album. "She wouldn't give up until we raised enough money to buy new beds for all the dogs." "Or the time she stayed up all night helping me practice for the school play," another added. She knew every line by heart, even though she wasn't even in it. Daniel moved through the crowd, thanking people, sharing updates, and drawing strength from their unwavering support. Each story, each memory of Sophie, felt like a thread weaving them all closer together. As the afternoon approached, people began to leave, but not before making plans for the week ahead. The youth group would meet daily to write letters. The women's ministry organized a prayer chain. The men's group planned to attend the next court hearing en masse, showing their solidarity. Daniel stood on the church steps, watching as families departed. The autumn breeze carried the sound of conversations, all centered around ways to help bring Sophie home. Where there had once been whispers of doubt, there was now a chorus of support. Pastor Evelyn joined him on the steps, her presence calm and reassuring. Do you feel it, Daniel? She asked softly. He nodded, unable to speak for a moment. The tide was turning. What had started as his solitary fight had become a community's mission. Each person who had stood up today, who had shared a memory of Sophie or offered to help, was a testament to the power of faith and love over fear and prejudice. Looking out over the church parking lot, where people were still gathering in small groups, making plans and sharing encouragement, Daniel felt something shift inside him. The weight he had been carrying didn't feel quite so heavy anymore. The community support wrapped around him like a warm embrace, reminding him that he and Sophie were not alone in this battle. For the first time since Sophie had been taken away, Daniel felt the tide truly turning. It wasn't just his voice crying out for justice anymore. It was the voice of an entire community, rising together in faith and determination. The county courthouse buzzed with tension on that crisp morning. Every wooden bench in courtroom 3 was packed, with people standing shoulder to shoulder along the back wall. Daniel Carter sat at the defendant's table in his best blue suit, the one he'd worn when Sophie graduated middle school last year. Though his hands trembled slightly, his eyes remained steady and clear. Miss Harper, the social worker, sat directly behind him, her presence a quiet source of strength. Pastor Evelyn and half the congregation filled 3 rows, while Frank, his investigator friend, kept checking his watch nervously. Even Mrs. Rodriguez from the diner had closed up shop to be there, still wearing her flour-dusted apron. At the plaintiff's table, the 5 lawyers from Sophie's mother's family sat in expensive suits, their leather briefcases arranged precisely before them. Lead counsel James Richardson adjusted his gold cufflinks with a slight smirk, clearly savoring what he assumed would be an easy victory. "Your Honor," Richardson said, rising smoothly to his feet, "we've clearly demonstrated Mr. Carter's unfitness as a parent. His financial instability, his questionable past conduct during his Supreme Court years, and most importantly, his deliberate deception of this court about his background, all point to one conclusion. Sophie belongs with her mother's family, where she'll have every advantage." He gestured to his colleagues. "We rest our case, Your Honor." The judge, an older woman with steel-gray hair and reading glasses perched on her nose, nodded. "Mr. Carter?" Daniel stood slowly, careful not to let his chair scrape against the floor. The familiar weight of his old leather briefcase, a gift from his late wife, felt right in his hand. He'd spent countless nights preparing for this moment, praying for wisdom and strength. "Your Honor," he began, his voice quiet but firm, "I'd like to present new evidence that will shed light on the true nature of these proceedings." He removed a thick manila envelope from his briefcase. Richardson's smirk faltered slightly. "Objection, Your Honor. Any new evidence should have been submitted during discovery." "Your Honor," Daniel responded, "this evidence only came to light this week, and it directly pertains to the accusations against me. Under Rule 60(b)(3), the court must consider evidence of fraud upon the court, regardless of timing." The judge adjusted her glasses. "Proceed, Mr. Carter." Daniel approached the bench with the envelope. "These documents show systematic tampering with evidence by the plaintiff's counsel. Specifically, they fabricated the allegations about my conduct during my Supreme Court years." A low murmur rippled through the courtroom. Richardson's face darkened. "First," Daniel continued, pulling out a stack of papers, "these are the original documents from the Supreme Court case in question. Note the date stamps and filing numbers." He handed copies to the judge and opposing counsel. "Now compare them to the versions submitted by Mr. Richardson's team." The judge studied both sets carefully while Daniel explained the discrepancies. He pointed out altered dates, missing pages, and most damningly, forged signatures. With each revelation, Richardson's colleagues shifted uncomfortably in their seats. "Furthermore," Daniel said, producing another document, "this affidavit from the Supreme Court clerk's office confirms that the accusations they presented never existed in the original case files." More whispers filled the courtroom. Mrs. Rodriguez crossed herself quietly. "But most troubling," Daniel continued, his voice growing stronger, "is this." He held up a final document. "An email chain between Mr. Richardson and his associates, planning this entire custody battle not out of concern for Sophie, but as retaliation for my walking away from their law firm 8 years ago." Richardson shot to his feet. "Objection! Those emails are privileged communication." "Not when they demonstrate fraud, Your Honor," Daniel replied calmly. "The privilege exception for crime or fraud applies here." The judge's face had grown increasingly grave. She studied the email printouts, her lips pressed into a thin line. Daniel wasn't finished. "I'd like to call Miss Jennifer Harper from Social Services." Miss Harper approached the witness stand, took her oath, and sat down. Her professional demeanor carried weight with the court. "Miss Harper, could you please tell the court about your home study findings?" "Objection," Richardson interrupted. "We've already heard the home study report." "Overruled," the judge said sharply. "I want to hear this." Miss Harper straightened in her chair. "Mr. Carter provides a stable, loving home for Sophie. While their financial situation is modest, all of Sophie's needs are met. More importantly, the emotional bond between father and daughter is exceptional. However," she paused, looking directly at Richardson, "I was approached by members of the plaintiff's team who tried to pressure me into altering my report." The courtroom erupted in shocked whispers. The judge banged her gavel once. Daniel methodically presented more evidence: statements from his neighbors, Sophie's school record showing her excellent grades and attendance, and documentation of every parent-teacher conference he'd attended. He demonstrated how the lawyers had cherry-picked and misrepresented information about his finances, ignoring his steady income and modest but mortgage-free home. One by one, he dismantled their arguments with the precision that had once made him legendary in Washington. But now, there was something more in his voice. Not just legal brilliance, but the quiet strength of a father fighting for his child. Finally, Daniel turned to face the court. "Your Honor, they've tried to paint me as an unfit father because I chose to leave a prestigious career to raise my daughter. They've suggested that love and stability can only be measured in dollar signs. They've committed fraud upon this court to separate a father from his child." His voice caught slightly. "I ask you to consider not just the law, but the truth of what's best for Sophie." The silence in the courtroom was absolute. Even Richardson had lost his smug expression, now conferring urgently with his colleagues in harsh whispers. The judge removed her glasses and rubbed her temples. "This is extremely troubling. I need time to review all this evidence thoroughly." She picked up her gavel. "This court will recess for 2 hours while I examine these documents. And Mr. Richardson?" The lawyer froze mid-whisper. "I suggest you and your colleagues remain in the building. We will have much to discuss about these allegations of misconduct." The gavel cracked sharply through the tense air. As the judge left the bench, the courtroom burst into murmured conversations. Pastor Evelyn wiped tears from her eyes, while Frank gave Daniel a thumbs up from the gallery. Daniel sank into his chair, emotionally drained but holding on to hope. 2 hours. In 2 hours, he would know if he could bring Sophie home. Judge Harrison entered the courtroom with measured steps, her black robes rustling as she took her seat. The packed gallery fell silent. Even the usual creak of the old courthouse's wooden benches seemed muted by the gravity of the moment. "Be seated," she commanded, adjusting her reading glasses as she studied the documents before her. Daniel sat rigid in his chair, his hands clasped tightly on the table. Pastor Evelyn and Miss Harper sat directly behind him, while dozens of familiar faces from town filled the rows beyond. The opposing lawyers lounged in their expensive suits, exchanging confident smirks. Judge Harrison cleared her throat. "After careful review of the evidence presented by Mr. Carter, I have reached several disturbing conclusions." She paused, her stern gaze sweeping across the courtroom. "The documents alleging misconduct during Mr. Carter's Supreme Court years have been proven, beyond any doubt, to be fabricated." A collective gasp rippled through the gallery. Daniel closed his eyes, relief washing over him like a wave. "Furthermore," the judge continued, her voice taking on an edge of controlled anger, "forensic examination has revealed that these false documents originated from the offices of the petitioning parties themselves." The smirks vanished from the lawyers' faces. One of them half rose from his chair, stuttering, "Your Honor, we can explain." "Sit down, Mr. Blackwood," Judge Harrison snapped. "I am not finished." The lawyer sank back into his seat, his face ashen. His colleagues shifted uncomfortably in their chairs, avoiding eye contact with anyone in the room. "This court takes an extremely dim view of such underhanded tactics," the judge declared. "Not only have you attempted to deceive this court with fraudulent evidence, but you have willfully endangered the welfare of a child for your own ends." She removed her glasses, fixing the lawyers with an icy stare. "I am referring this matter to the State Bar Association for disciplinary action. You may well find yourselves facing disbarment proceedings." Murmurs of approval swept through the gallery. Miss Harper squeezed Pastor Evelyn's hand, both women fighting back tears of joy. "As to the matter before us today," Judge Harrison continued, her voice softening slightly as she turned toward Daniel. "Mr. Carter has demonstrated not only his fitness as a parent, but his unwavering commitment to his daughter's well-being. The petition for custody is hereby dismissed with prejudice." The courtroom erupted in cheers. Daniel remained frozen in his seat, hardly daring to believe it was real. Furthermore, the judge raised her voice over the commotion. "I am ordering the immediate restoration of Sophie Carter to her father's custody." As if on cue, the side door opened, and Sophie appeared with her temporary guardian. She stood there for a moment, her eyes searching the room until they found Daniel. Time seemed to stop as father and daughter locked eyes across the courtroom. "Daddy!" Sophie's cry cut through the noise as she broke free, running past the bailiff and through the gate that separated the gallery from the court proper. Daniel rose from his chair, just as Sophie crashed into him, her arms wrapping tight around his waist. He lifted her off her feet, holding her close as tears streamed down both their faces. The applause in the courtroom swelled, punctuated by sniffles and words of congratulation. "I knew you'd win, Daddy," Sophie sobbed into his shoulder. "I knew you wouldn't let them take me away." Daniel could barely speak through his tears. He just held his daughter tighter, one hand cradling the back of her head while the other rubbed soothing circles on her back, the same way he had comforted her since she was tiny. The lawyers filed out in disgrace, but nobody paid them any attention. The focus was entirely on the reunion taking place in the middle of the courtroom. Pastor Evelyn led a prayer of thanksgiving from her seat, her voice thick with emotion. Miss Harper wiped her eyes with a tissue, beaming at the father and daughter she had fought to keep together. Judge Harrison watched the scene with a rare smile, allowing the celebration to continue for several moments before gently rapping her gavel. "This court is adjourned," she announced, adding more softly, "God bless you both." The applause continued as Daniel finally set Sophie down, keeping one arm wrapped protectively around her shoulders. Their friends and neighbors surrounded them, offering hugs and handshakes. Old Mr. Jenkins from the hardware store clapped Daniel on the back. Sophie's teachers were there, along with half her class and their parents. Through it all, Sophie didn't let go of her father's hand. She looked up at him with shining eyes, and in that moment, all the fear and uncertainty of the past weeks melted away. They were together. They were home. The morning sun streamed through the high courthouse windows, painting everything in warm light. The old building had seen countless battles fought within its walls, but few victories had been sweeter than this one. A father's love triumphing over power and wealth, truth prevailing over deception, faith rewarded after the darkest hour. The evening sun cast long shadows across Daniel and Sophie's driveway as they pulled up to their modest home. After the emotional triumph at the courthouse, both were exhausted but filled with quiet joy. Their small house had never looked more beautiful, with its weathered blue paint and slightly crooked mailbox. But they weren't alone. The front yard was filled with familiar faces, neighbors, church members, and friends from all over town. Mrs. Peterson from next door clutched a steaming casserole dish. The Martinez family held a bouquet of bright yellow daisies. Even gruff old Mr. Thompson, who rarely left his house, stood among the well-wishers. "Welcome home, Sophie," several voices called out in unison. Sophie's eyes widened, and she squeezed her father's hand. "Daddy, look at everyone!" Daniel's throat tightened with emotion as he helped Sophie out of the car. People surged forward, surrounding them with warm hugs and congratulations. Mrs. Peterson pressed her casserole into Daniel's hands, her eyes glistening. "It's your favorite chicken and rice, dear," she said to Sophie. "Made it fresh this afternoon." "Thank you," Sophie whispered, hugging the older woman tightly. The Martinez children rushed forward with their flowers. "These are for both of you," Maria Martinez explained, her youngest son Pedro beaming up at Sophie. One by one, neighbors appeared with dishes of comfort food: lasagna, pot pies, fresh-baked bread. The small kitchen counter soon overflowed with their generosity. Pastor Evelyn arranged vases of flowers on the dining room table, while Miss Harper helped organize the food. Sophie tugged at Daniel's sleeve.
"Can we go to the garage, Daddy? I want to do something special."
Daniel nodded, following his daughter to their familiar sanctuary. The garage still smelled of motor oil and metal, but Sophie went straight to her little art corner where she kept her craft supplies. She pulled out poster board and paint. "I want to make a sign," she declared, already squeezing out bright colors onto a paper plate. Daniel watched as she carefully painted each letter, her tongue sticking out in concentration. The words took shape. Home, sweet home. She decorated the edges with little hearts and stars, then held it up proudly. "It's perfect," Daniel said softly. "Where should we put it?" "Right here." Sophie pointed to the wall above her father's workbench, where they'd spent countless hours together as he fixed cars and taught her about tools. "So everyone can see it when they come in." They hung the sign together, Sophie insisting on hammering in the nail herself, while Daniel steadied the stepladder. The fresh paint glistened in the garage's fluorescent light, a testament to their victory and their bond. Back outside, more neighbors had arrived. Daniel found himself surrounded by handshakes and pats on the back. Mr. Thompson cleared his throat gruffly. "Carter," he said, extending a calloused hand. "What you did in there, standing up to those fancy lawyers, well, it showed real grit. We're proud to have you in this town." Daniel shook his hand, touched by the usually taciturn man's words. "Thank you. I couldn't have done it without everyone's support." Sophie darted between the groups of people, showing off her sign to anyone who would look. Her laughter, so recently threatened with silence, rang out clear and strong in the evening air. As the sun began to set, the crowd slowly dispersed with final hugs and well wishes. Daniel and Sophie stood on their front porch, waving goodbye until the last car pulled away. Inside, Sophie helped Daniel clear space on the kitchen table among the flowers and casserole dishes. He found 2 candles in a drawer and lit them, their warm glow dancing across the walls. "Just you and me now, kiddo," Daniel said, serving them both portions of Mrs. Peterson's chicken and rice. Sophie nodded, her eyes reflecting the candlelight. Just like always, they sat across from each other, savoring the simple meal. The familiar kitchen, the quiet hum of the refrigerator, the slight squeak of Sophie's chair when she shifted, all the small details of home felt precious now. "We're together," Sophie whispered, reaching across the table to hold her father's hand. "That's enough." Daniel squeezed her fingers gently, his heart full. "That's more than enough, sweetheart. That's everything." They finished their dinner in comfortable silence, the candlelight casting warm shadows on the walls of their home, their sanctuary, their victory, their peace. Through the kitchen window, stars began to appear in the darkening sky, twinkling down on the little house where love had proven stronger than power, and truth had prevailed over deception. The garage light still glowed softly through the window, illuminating Sophie's sign. Its simple message said everything that needed to be said. They were home, they were together, and that was all that mattered. The autumn evening wrapped the town square in golden light as people gathered for the celebration. Strings of twinkling lights crisscrossed overhead, and the scent of hot apple cider and fresh-baked cookies wafted through the air. Daniel Carter stood near the makeshift stage, tugging nervously at his collar while Sophie straightened his tie. "You look perfect, Daddy," Sophie said, smoothing down his jacket lapels. Her eyes sparkled with pride, and she wore the yellow dress they'd picked out together last weekend. Pastor Evelyn approached them, her warm smile as reassuring as ever. "The whole town's here," she said, gesturing to the growing crowd. "They all want to celebrate with you both." Daniel looked around, amazed at how many familiar faces filled the square. Mrs. Thompson from the diner was serving her famous peach cobbler. Mr. Rodriguez, who'd testified as a character witness, stood chatting with other neighbors. Even Miss Harper, the social worker, had come, waving cheerfully from across the square. The setting sun painted the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks as Mayor Jenkins stepped up to the microphone. "Friends and neighbors," he began, "we're here tonight to celebrate something special. The triumph of truth over deception, of love over power, and of faith over fear." Daniel felt Sophie's small hand slip into his as the mayor continued. "We've all watched the Carter family face an incredible challenge. Their story has taught us about courage, about standing together, and about never giving up on what's right." The crowd murmured in agreement, and several people wiped away tears. Pastor Evelyn squeezed Daniel's shoulder gently. "And now," the mayor said, "I'd like to invite Daniel Carter to say a few words." Sophie gave her father a gentle push toward the stage. Daniel walked up slowly, his footsteps echoing in the microphone. He looked out at the sea of friendly faces, People who had stood by him, brought meals during the hardest days, testified in court, and prayed without ceasing. "I'm not much for speeches," Daniel began, his voice quiet but steady. "But I want to thank you all. When those lawyers came to my door that Saturday morning, I thought I was alone. I thought power and money would win." He paused, catching Sophie's eye in the crowd. She beamed at him, and he found the strength to continue. "But you showed me different. You showed me that a community bound by love and truth is stronger than any amount of money or influence. You reminded me that faith isn't just about believing. It's about standing firm when everything seems impossible." Several people nodded, and someone called out, "We love you, Daniel." Daniel smiled, emotion thick in his voice. "My daughter Sophie taught me the most important lesson of all. She showed me that speaking truth with love can change hearts." She never stopped believing, never stopped fighting for our family. Sophie wiped happy tears from her eyes as Pastor Evelyn wrapped an arm around her shoulders. "Someone once told me that the measure of a community isn't in its buildings or its wealth," Daniel continued. "It's in how we care for each other, how we stand together when one of us is falling. You've shown me what that means." The crowd burst into applause, and Daniel had to wait for it to quiet before he could finish. "So thank you. Thank you for believing in us, for fighting alongside us, for showing Sophie what real community looks like. We're blessed to call this town our home." The applause was thunderous this time. People stood, cheering and whistling. Sophie ran to the stage and threw her arms around her father as he stepped down. Pastor Evelyn wiped tears from her eyes, and even Mayor Jenkins looked moved. As the sky darkened, the first fireworks shot into the air with a whistle, exploding in a shower of red and gold sparks. The crowd oohed and ahed, faces turned upward to watch the display. Daniel knelt beside Sophie, drawing her close as more fireworks painted the sky. Blues, greens, and silvers reflected in her wide eyes. The noise of the celebration faded around them as he looked at his daughter, his brave, beautiful girl who had never lost faith. "Sophie," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, "you were never going anywhere." She turned to him, her smile brighter than any firework, and threw her arms around his neck. They held each other tight as the town cheered and the sky blazed with light, their hearts full of gratitude and joy. The fireworks continued to burst overhead, each explosion a celebration of love's victory over fear, of truth's triumph over lies. The townspeople gathered close, sharing hugs and congratulations, their faces glowing with happiness for the father and daughter who had taught them all about the power of faith, love, and community. Pastor Evelyn stood nearby, her eyes glistening as she watched Daniel and Sophie embrace. She remembered her own words from those dark days, that faith shines brightest in darkness. Now, as fireworks illuminated the night sky and joy filled the town square, she knew those words had never been truer. Daniel and Sophie remained in their embrace as the celebration continued around them, their bond stronger than ever, their hearts full of peace and gratitude. They were home, they were together, and they were surrounded by love, everything they had fought so hard to protect. What would you do if you were in their place? Comment your answer below, and let's see how you'd rewrite the ending. If you enjoyed the story of Daniel Carter, I handpicked the next story that you will enjoy. Please don't miss this one. Click here to watch it.